evening. We greatly appreciate your time, your energy, your passion, your commitment. There's lots of other things you could be doing this evening, and that you prioritize this for an opportunity for learning and discussion. We greatly appreciate it. I'd like to go ahead and introduce the three panelists that we have with us today: Scott Potter, Professor Jordan Clark, and Mike Shelton. Scott Potter is Senior Director of Comprehensive Energy Management here at Ohio State University. He has primary responsibility for the oversight of Ohio State University Energy Partnership Agreement. He serves as the university liaison for the Ohio State Energy Partners, as well as chairing the Energy Advisory Committee. He has more than 28 years of public and private sector utility experience with expertise in power purchase agreements, building energy efficiency, utility demand response, and utility regulation. Professor Jordan Clark holds a dual appointment here at Ohio State University within the College of Engineering, a majority appointment in the Department of Civil, Environmental, and Geodetic Engineering, and a minor appointment in Construction Systems Management, a program housed in the Department of Food, Ag, and Biological Engineering. He's also a core faculty member of the Sustainability Institute here at Ohio State. His research focuses on measuring, modeling, and predicting energy consumption and power demand in campus buildings. Mike Shelton is Associate Director for the Sustainability Institute, leading the development of tracking and reporting systems for the university's sustainability goals. He manages the Ohio State Sustainability Fund and helps to manage the work of the President and Provost Council on Sustainability. He serves as a project manager for a number of sustainability-related projects on campus, and was one of the primary movers and shakers behind the Climate Action Plan that the university released earlier this year. We're going to go ahead and get started with our panel. I'm going to go ahead and pose a few of the questions. We greatly appreciate you all having submitted questions ahead of time, and so we've taken some of the ones that were the most common, and I'm going to pose those of the panelists to get started. I also just wanted to note that there was a FAQ, frequently asked questions document, that was circulated with the meeting invite, so hopefully you guys received that, and feel free to reference that as well during our discussion. And again, just want to thank you guys for attending, for your passion for sustainable climate solutions, and the dedication that you're showing to our campus. I would also like to say that if there was a question that was covered in the FAQ, and we're probably not going to spend a whole lot of time on it during the discussion tonight. And so we'll just try to focus on questions that are new in addition to FAQ. So Scott, let me start off, if you don't mind, just inviting you to describe the university's current energy system and how the combined heat and power facility, CHP facility, would transform the system. And if you could clarify the role that NG has played in this versus Ohio State.
Absolutely. First, let me say thanks for inviting me to the panel. Welcome to all the participants. I'm glad to know that there's so much interest. Really, to describe Ohio State's energy system in a nutshell, we are essentially a small city. We use about as much electricity and heating, natural gas heating, as about 50,000 typical 2,000 square foot homes, if that gives you an idea. We use steam and electricity year round. Everybody understands electricity, but a lot of people are surprised to understand that we use steam heat year round, 365 days a year. On the hottest day of summer, we're probably burning about 100,000 or producing about 100,000 pounds of steam per hour. A pound of steam is the amount of steam you get from 1 pound of water, and it's generally measured in pounds of steam. In the winter, we go from 100,000 pounds of steam per hour to 500,000 pounds of steam per hour. We use steam both for heating in most of our buildings, but we use it a lot for process as well. Our med center relies on steam for a lot of its sterilization processes, as well as very precise temperature and humidity control. We also use steam in most of our dining facilities for cooking, and in our libraries and museums, again, for precise humidity control. The role that NG, or Ohio State Energy Partners, plays at Ohio State is really just to operate our system. The university still buys all of the commodity electricity and natural gas, water, and fuel oil that we use. We buy that on the wholesale market and deliver it to NG to use in operating our system. So they operate our power plants, our chiller plants. They're also responsible for maintaining those systems. For those of you who are sophomores or higher in rank, you will recall the mess that the Oval was for a long period of time. And that was because NG, as our energy partner, was replacing and repairing some very old steam tunnels and steam lines. So that's its essential role is to operate the system and to improve and expand and repair and replace as needed. They don't have any role in our selection of the type of energy we use, nor do they have any role in the procurement of that.
Thanks, Scott. Just a follow-up question there. Just to kind of level the playing field so we all have a common understanding, could you just explain how does a CHP facility function? Number one, and number two, why did the university decide to move with this option as opposed to others that were considered?
Sure. CHPs, short for combined heat and power. So in a traditional system like we have at Ohio State today and many universities and industries around the world, you have heat production and you have power. So in our system today, we produce heat in the McCracken power plant using traditional gas-fired steam boilers. So we combust natural gas to produce steam in those boilers. Excess heat or waste heat is exhausted through the giant stacks. I'm sure you've seen on a cold winter day when it appears these giant clouds are coming out. That's excess steam or waste heat, if you will. A combined heat and power plant uses the combustion of natural gas but produces both products, the heat and the electricity. And it depends on how you can configure it sort of either way, where heat comes first and electricity comes second, or electricity comes first and heat comes second. In the power plant that we're building, we will use natural gas to produce electricity, capture the waste heat from that production to produce steam or heating hot water, simultaneously using natural gas to produce steam in the steam turbines. And again, we could use the waste heat to produce more electricity or more heating hot water. So now in the CHP, we will get two functions or two benefits out of the same combustion of gas.
Gotcha. And could you tell us just a little bit how did this option compare to some of the others that were considered?
So our principal need was thermal. So we could continue to buy electricity from the power grid as we are doing today. But as I mentioned, we have a really big thermal need. And that's with our current campus. That's before we build 2 new hospitals, a new central sterilization facility, a new arts district, and a new research tower. So we saw that we were short of thermal, or we're going to be short of our thermal need. So we looked at, could we add new boilers, just like the ones we have in McCracken, and produce that steam locally at each of those buildings? And we absolutely could. But it was less cost effective, less environmentally friendly, and certainly less energy efficient. So we really thought the CHP made sense. A couple other options that some people point to are like geothermal and or on-campus renewable generation. Since our issue was thermal, on-campus renewable generation wouldn't solve that. We could switch to 100% renewable electricity right now, but we'd still have the need for the thermal product. The problem with geothermal is its limitations, both geographically and in heat transfer. On the South Oval, we have a number of geothermal wells, more than 500 in total, that produce about a third of the heating and cooling need for the South Res district, but only about a third. but they don't produce steam. So even if we use geothermal, if we had the space and the real estate available, we would pull that heat out of the ground, but we would still have to add heat through the combustion of some fossil fuel to bring that up to a steam level necessary to run our buildings. So, but the biggest issue with geothermal is the availability of real estate. For just the south dorms, it took the entire south oval to produce about a third of the heating and cooling capacity we needed. So if you extrapolate that out to the type of heat we need for the whole university, it's just not feasible at this time, and especially given the geology or our subsurface condition, which is fractured limestone requiring cased wells.
Thanks, Scott. I'm gonna try to come back just for one more question from you, but before I do, I just want to toss it to Jordan, because I mean, you're really emphasizing the need for heating, and that being the critical limitation and consideration in terms of having gone with this option. So, Jordan, I'm wondering, there's probably, I know I was in this boat before I learned more of the details of our energy systems over time, but could you just explain the difference between the need for heating energy and electricity, and how those are generated for use within our buildings?
Yeah, sure. So whenever we're talking about energy efficiency in buildings, which is kind of what I do and what I'm concerned with day to day, any kind of solution, the first thing we have to think about, the first thing usually, and the second thing, and the third thing often, is the climate and the location. Where are we? So solutions for Ohio are going to look a lot different than solutions for Texas or for California. Specifically, if we look at the portion of our energy that's used for different end uses in buildings, Ohio is what we call a heating climate. We're dominated by our energy consumption. The biggest portion of that is our need for heating our buildings. So it's not the things necessarily that we're plugging into the walls. It's not our air conditioners. Those do use energy for sure, but we're dominated by the need for heating. So any kind of look at how we reduce the footprint of our buildings is going to have to first look at heating. So how can we heat our buildings? We can't have cold buildings. We're not going to have classrooms that are operating in the wintertime at 10 degrees Fahrenheit, right? So we have to heat our buildings. There's a couple different ways we can provide heat. One of the oldest ways is, of course, we can light something on fire, right? If we were in the developing world, we might be using some kind of biomass in a stove, and we're lighting this on fire. The breakdown of these molecular bonds is giving off energy, and that's heating our home. But even with that, if you think about it, if you got a fire in the middle of your house and kind of think of a black kettle stove, a portion of the energy is getting into your home, and then there's also a flue that's going out the top of your house, and that's hot air that's leaving. So a big portion of the energy that you just polluted the atmosphere with in order to generate is leaving your house as well. And that's not useful energy, right? So this is where the kind of CHP concept comes in. This happens at power plants as well. Any kind of exhaust that has a temperature that's greater than the ambient environment, that's an inefficiency. That's energy that we're using, and it's not helping us at all. That's carbon we're putting in the atmosphere and for no use. Another way we can heat is with electricity. So the worst way we could do that is just to run what we call a resistive heater. If you've ever touched your laptop when it's working and it's hot, or your power strip, that heat, that's resistive heating. Anytime you run an electrical current through anything with any kind of electrical resistance, it's going to dissipate heat. So we can take advantage of this to heat our homes, and some of the oldest kind of baseboard heaters took advantage of this. Really inefficient way to do that. And one of the reasons for that is that electricity came from somewhere, right? So any electricity delivered to your home or to your office, that was generated somewhere far, far away, usually at a power plant. At the power plant, we're lighting something on fire again. We light something on fire, and immediately we lose about a third of that energy on the site. And then we need to transmit and distribute this energy to the end user, to us. And again, we're going to lose about a third of the energy in that process. So by the time we're using it, we've already lost about 2/3 of the energy we started with just in the generation and transmission distribution process. So using electricity to heat also has its drawbacks, and the CHP takes advantage of both of these by locating the generation kind of near to the end use for one thing, and by capturing some of that heat that we would have otherwise just exhausted into the atmosphere. Hope that's a good overview.
Makes sense. Thank you. One last question while we're on the topic of buildings. You know, one of the root challenges of all of this is the fact that we're building new buildings, and that's not necessarily a bad thing in and of itself. It shows that we're growing. It shows that we're engaging in new activities, whether it's medical or research or other. But of course, with all of those new buildings comes this pressure for an increase in energy consumption and demand from our campus. I know there's a lot of things that you and others faculty are doing to help us figure out how we can be more energy efficient and reduce our reliance on energy use, especially fossil fuel energy. Could you talk about some of those things?
Yeah, sure. So one of the things I'm engaged in coordination with OSEP is modeling and optimization of community scale energy systems. So it's kind of hard to overstate what an opportunity we have here at Ohio State because of the things that NG and OSEP are doing to study energy efficiency and what we call demand management. So moving around power demand and time at a community level. So as Scott said, we have something like 100,000 people here when it's not a pandemic. We have a small city here. So OSEP has also monitored quite a bit of the energy consumption around campus. So we have an entire city and we can take advantage of things at the community level, at the city level, come up with solutions that can then be replicated by other municipalities and things like that. And that's kind of the area where my research is going right now. And a lot of people are excited about the efficiencies we can gain at a community level.
That's cool. Thanks. I want to take the question a little bit, conversation a little bit different of a direction. And Mike, I want to ask you a question. You know, I know that, I mean, one of the big concerns with the CHP facility is that it is run on natural gas, and it is not in and of itself, of course, a zero emission facility by far. You have done a tremendous amount of work with the Climate Action Plan for the university, which has as its primary motivation the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions by 55% within the next 10 years by 2030. Can you talk just a little bit about how this plan fits with the CAP, the Climate Action Plan?
Sure, thanks, Lena. Just to take a step back, the Climate Action Plan has a variety of components and is really a point in time assessment of what the university's emissions and different sources of emissions are, and then an outline of how to address those individual sources of emissions. So the original Climate Action Plan the university did was in 2010 or 2011. And the goal for carbon neutrality was set in 2008. So that first Climate Action Plan was really more of an assessment of the university trying to get its arms around how to develop its carbon footprint and how to make that reporting. This updated version is really more of a roadmap of now we have a much better ability to track our emissions across a variety of sources. And now we need to start thinking about what are the different strategies we can put in place to address those individual sources of emissions. It turns out that kind of unlike the rest of the world, the university being place-based is very most of our emissions, almost 3/4 of them, come from building and campus energy use. That is primarily our grid purchased energy, which is the #1 source of our emissions currently, and then after that our natural gas related emissions for heating, as Scott outlined earlier. So within the Climate Action Plan, you'll see a number of different strategies on how we can reduce or address, i.e. offset some of our emissions that can't be eliminated in a variety of ways. And we anticipate that, this will be an iterative process. We'll make progress where we can, and in a couple of years, we'll have to redo the climate action plan to reassess where we're at in the future. The CHP, just to highlight, I think what Scott said is an opportunity to essentially displace the majority of our grid purchased energy. So, we're really getting two bites at the apple with every molecule burned to generate energy. We get electricity and we get heating from that power source. So if we can displace our purchase of grid energy, that helps us remove coal from our equation. Fiscal 19, which the climate action plan is really kind of built on, coal is still a third of our purchased energy from the grid. So with nuclear actually being the top portion of that, and then natural gas being kind of the third component of our grid purchased energy. So if we can displace those emissions from the grid, then we will have, kind of an immediate reduction on our overall carbon footprint for the university through the CHP. Now that will, there'll be a point in time where the grid continues to green, and that annual benefit of emission reductions will decline over time. So that is also looked at and considered in the climate action plan as well. But that's anticipated to be a number of years out. Unfortunately, in Ohio, renewable energy is still something around 5% of our grid energy. It's going to take a fair amount of time for that change to take place.
Mike, what about renewables and the opportunities for increasing our renewable portfolio?
Yeah, that's right. Sorry, I didn't mention that. So the climate action plan does contemplate how we can not only maintain what the university is already doing, which in context for other institutions of higher education is pretty substantial. Our relationship with the Blue Creek wind farm generates a considerable amount of energy. I think it's 100 million megawatts annually around there. Scott will correct me if I'm wrong in that regard, which is about, I think in last fiscal year, about 17% of our total electricity use for the university. So we, first and foremost, is once that agreement ends, we would want to seek to replace that so that we can at least continue the amount of renewable energy we're currently using. But we want to add, don't want to stop there. We want to continue to add to the portfolio. And we can do that in a couple of different ways. One, we can obviously increase the amount of additional purchase of renewable energy for the gap between what the CHP will generate for the university and what we're still purchasing from the grid beyond that. So that's contemplated within the climate action plan. Then also adding on-campus opportunities for additional renewable energy, particularly solar. That tracks well with our use patterns here on campus. So, we're hoping certainly to develop additional projects in that regard. We are hindered. There's no doubt about that from a return on investment standpoint, particularly for on-site solar. There are very few projects at this time that provide what's referred to as net present value for the project, meaning the project essentially at least pays for itself, if not generates a positive economic return over the life of the project. So if a panel is going to last 20, 25, 30 years, you're at least seeing the amount of electricity generation on an annual basis that pays the investment off, the upfront investment off over time, over that period of time. And we are just not able to achieve a great ROI at this time. Part of that is because of historically low energy prices right now, which challenges the economics of solar particularly. But also part of that is just, we don't have the great open areas to plunk down and develop for solar farms or rooftop space to do so. So there's some logistical challenges, but those are things that we want to certainly work to overcome.
Great. Last question, Mike. There's been a lot of talk about the city of Columbus that has now, which it's been great. They've announced a carbon neutrality goal by 2050 as well. And to meet that goal, they have a plan to aggregate power purchasing for renewable energy. Can you just explain how does that fit with Ohio State's efforts? How does it impact Ohio State's efforts?
Yeah, it's very encouraging and exciting for Mayor Ginther and his team to put forward not only the carbon neutrality goal for the city itself, but also to advance the aggregation proposal that'll be on this November's ballot for the city, for city residents to consider as they vote. So the aggregation plan is really driven to address homeowner electricity use. What will happen is if that measure is approved, it will enable the city to, on behalf of the residents of Columbus, negotiate on their behalf to purchase renewable electricity sourcing. So, that it allows, I think, citizens to opt out if they don't want to participate, or if they've already done, their own electricity choice decisions, they don't have to participate in the aggregation program. And then some small businesses are included in that. So I think the upper limit that the city is allowing into the program is something like 700,000 kilowatt hours per year. Ohio State is somewhere more like 600 million kilowatt annual usage. So we're not even eligible to participate in that aggregation program. And just to clarify again, it's a effort to address electricity use, not heating use. So residents will still continue primarily to utilize Columbia gas for their heating here in Columbus. So even if Ohio State was able to participate in that, it would not address our thermal needs that Scott and Jordan addressed earlier.
Gotcha. All right. We have a lot of students who are yearning to get to the Q&A portion of this. So we're going to go ahead and switch to that. And I'm going to take some Q&A that's here in the Q&A box. The first question is with respect to consideration of renewable alternatives, such as wind and solar. The question is whether and what documentation Ohio State has in terms of providing documentation of those alternatives, and how are they considered, and why is it that Ohio State did not go with those alternatives? So Scott, could I direct that question to you? You're muted.
Yeah, sorry, I was typing answers.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Alternatives. So as I think Mike just shared, the alternative for renewable energy, either solar or wind or hydro at scale off campus, is not an alternative. It would provide none of the thermal benefit. If we switch to 100% renewable energy today, we would still need to combust gas to produce the thermal benefits, the thermal energy we need.
And we would do that how?
I would say we would still want to do that with the CHP plant because it's more efficient and a better environmental output than just standard boilers. Because standard boilers, as Professor Clark noted, you combust the gas, you get the heat, but you also lose a lot of heat that's not used again. In a CHP format, you combust the gas, you get the heat, but you also capture the waste heat and use it. So given the constraints we have, I think CHP was the best decision to do, the best thing we could do now. It's not the ultimate decision, but it's the best step to take now.
And I guess what, people are really trying to understand is, given what has happened with renewables, and the scaling of renewables that has occurred as this transition is happening, why can't OSU go to 100% renewables for electricity and continue to do what it's doing in terms of generating heat? What would be wrong with that option?
Technically, from an engineering perspective, nothing. We could absolutely do that. I noticed a question from an anonymous attendee mentioned that they toured the McCracken last year, and they learned that the plant was 30% efficient. That's absolutely correct. That's the nature of a single fire boiler. You burn gas, and it's about 30% efficient. You could upgrade those to brand new boilers and get a little more efficiency, but not much. The beauty of CHP is when we turn it on, McCracken is going to go from producing 100% of the central steam to producing more like 15%. So we're going to put that poor efficiency at the bottom of the stack, so to speak. It's only on the coldest days and on those days where CHP will be down for maintenance that we'll have to rely on McCracken. But actually, when we turn the power plant on, one of the boilers in McCracken will be immediately retired. So we could do 100% renewables. We are investigating for energy, for electricity. We're investigating that right now. We constantly are going to the market looking for affordable renewable energy that can be delivered to campus in an affordable way. A lot of people don't realize that even when you buy the commodity, like today, you can go buy wind or solar energy for $30, maybe even $29 per megawatt hour. That's really a low price commodity. It's not quite as low as what we pay, but it's really low. But by the time you pay to have that transmitted and distributed to get it to campus, all of the adders that are also losses, because you have line loss, by the time it gets to campus, the cost to the university is almost double. Our wind energy costs us about $49 when we buy it at the wind farm. By the time it gets delivered to campus, it's well over $70, which is twice the price we pay for regular energy. And it'll be 3 or 4 times the price we'll pay for energy produced on campus where there are no line losses.
Okay, let me move to another question, which has to do with some of the concerns with respect to health impacts and environmental impacts. Natural gas in Ohio is from unconventional shale gas development, and that has a variety of impacts in terms of the wastewater and other impacts in terms of the physical conversion of land and where these wells are being drilled. What has OSU done in terms of thinking about these broader set of impacts? As we are contributing to consuming natural gas, which we are currently, but as we think about building this new facility, what are the considerations that have gone into thinking about the environmental impacts of the natural gas facility?
Was that to me?
Why don't you start and then we'll pass it off?
Yeah. So yeah, I may be the worst person to answer it because I come obviously first from a financial position. The impacts of the source of a fuel, be it natural gas or coal or nuclear, are not a consideration in the state's regulatory sort of a view of those fuels and those energies. So when we do an environmental analysis for a power plant, for instance, like a CHP, it's really right or wrong, the legal test is the impact of that plant at its place of construction. I do want to mention, I know there's a lot of concern with fracking, and a lot of people equate this to Ohio gas. It is by no means assured. In fact, it's less likely that most of the gas that we burn on campus comes from Ohio. We buy gas on the wholesale competitive market from a supplier. We don't buy gas from Columbia. Columbia Gas of Ohio is simply the transport entity. Most of our gas comes up from Southern Ohio through a particular pipeline, which the largest feeds from that pipeline are from the Gulf and from the Colorado Basin. So you can never know exactly what molecules you have, just like you never know what electrons you have. But just if you follow the pipeline, and on a pipeline, the closer you are to the source, you're the first off taker. So it's likely that most of our gas comes from far south and far west of the state of Ohio. That doesn't mitigate the impacts, obviously, of drilling and exploration. But I just did want to say that it's not a given that this is Ohio fracked gas, so to speak.
Yeah, but as we think about these broader impacts, it is certainly the case that as we continue to rely on natural gas, that we're not, we're continuing to feed that demand for natural gas, and as opposed to demand for renewables. And I think that's one of the things that lots of people, myself included, and lots of other people are struggling with in this solution. And I think it underscores the fact that this is this is not a black and white issue. This is an issue that is has many different considerations and trade-offs, and it is one in which Ohio State has set a target in terms of greenhouse gas emission reductions, but there are other environmental impacts that come into play, and those have to be balanced against the emission reductions that we are able to achieve with the CHP facility. Mike, could you speak a little bit more just about some of the trade-off considerations? The Climate Action Plan has some of that. I know it doesn't have a full environmental, it doesn't have the whole suite of environmental impacts considered, because that's not the point of the Climate Action Plan. But what are some of those trade-offs that are considered?
Well, I think obviously everyone recognizes the social and environmental impacts that fracking has had, throughout the shale region of Ohio, Western PA, West Virginia, states throughout the country. Still, allowing us to move off of grid energy allows us to move away from coal, which has similarly devastating and historical environmental and social impacts to those often same communities, and a much longer legacy of impact that needs to be remediated from usually taxpayers often. So I don't think that it's fair to just look at the impacts of natural gas fracking in a silo without also considering how we are trying to move away from a more carbon intensive energy source that also has negative impacts from an environmental and social standpoint. So that, that's not really territory we cover in the Climate Action Plan, but it is certainly a reality. I don't know if I'm answering the question here, Elena, but there are certainly challenges in how do I want to phrase this? I think there's a lot of appropriate concern for not moving more rapidly to renewable energy, and that can physically be done, as Scott said, but the it's a cost to the university. We are a public institution. That funding has to come from somewhere. So if we are going to have to pay for more renewable electricity, there are going to be implications back to the university, whether that's, less resources for students, less resources for faculty, less resources for outreach that the university does. There's going to be an impact. And so how can we move to lower carbon intensive energy sources at which the university can afford the most quickly, particularly over the next decade, where we want to achieve as many emission reductions as we possibly can before we hit that 2030 tipping point, where kind of as the IPCC has indicated, if we don't reduce half of our emissions by then, there's really nothing that can be done to avoid 2 degrees Celsius or worse. So, what can we do now that we can afford that still enables us to make progress here and in the long term to address our emission footprint? I don't know.
So Mike, it does help. And I want to push on that point a bit, because I mean, I don't think that anyone's trying to hide the fact that there are negative impacts from the choices we're making. I think that that's clear. And I think that that's clearly a frustration that a lot of students and faculty and others have. And it is, if we could avoid those negative impacts, we would love to be able to do that. And so I think it's worth pushing on what is the trade-off that OSU is making in making this decision, and why, from a negative impact perspective, does it make sense? And so I want to ask you a little bit further about why is it so important that we should make decisions to reduce emissions in the next 10 years? I mean, essentially we're prioritizing that choice and our ability to do that over some of these other considerations. So just walk us through why that is so important from the perspective of the Climate Action Plan and the broader perspective of environmental impacts.
Yeah, it goes back to, where we're seeing direction from IPCC, the International Panel on Climate Change, on what global emissions need to be addressed within that time frame to avoid locking in the worst outcomes of climate change, regardless of what is done after 2030. So if society writ large does not act to, again, cut its emissions essentially in half by 2030, then we are setting ourselves up for failure post 2030, regardless of what actions we take to try and claw back some of those emissions after that date. So we are hoping to address a little over half of our emissions through the actions outlined in the Climate Action Plan. And I would say, some of those they're not a given. It's not a given that we will, find the ability or wherewithal to site 10 megawatts of solar on campus. It's not a given that we will develop a program to offset the university's air travel emissions. It's not a given that we will find a way to develop carbon sinks that can appropriately be accounted back to the university for sequestering more carbon on our landscapes. So these are things that we're going to need the community to be supportive of and to push for at Ohio State, for us to address all these different sources of emissions that the university has, and offset emissions that we cannot reduce or eliminate. The CHP, again, is the best opportunity to provide the heating needs that we have while still reducing emissions simultaneously over the next 10, 15, 20 years. It does obviously, rely on a fossil fuel, and that is significantly challenging. But we have to, continue to push for finding ways and, potential fuel switches in the future that will allow us to still heat the campus, still power the campus with electricity to meet our growing need as a university. I did see a comment pop up that, this is almost a bit of, cart before the horse. If the university, our college units, our department units did not see a need for additional buildings, additional spaces, we would not see an increase in demand for energy use. So first and foremost, we have to be able to utilize the spaces we already have in an efficient manner so that we don't create additional need for the use of energy within our buildings. And I think one of the silver linings of the pandemic is that it gives us an opportunity to rethink how we do business as a university. Is there an opportunity for additional work from home or school from home opportunities to reduce the amount of building space and built space we need on campus to house everyone that was on campus on a daily basis pre-pandemic? So, there are opportunities to continue to limit and reduce demand for energy on campus. But as we continue to build out, it's just going to be a challenge for us to address these needs.
Jordan, I wonder if I could toss it back to you for a second. I think a lot of people are struggling with understanding. I mean, why is it that costs for renewable technologies have come down so much, but yet we're not instantaneously transitioning to this renewable energy world? From your perspective, and what are the challenges, what are the barriers, and why can't we?
Yep. So again, I would stress that we have to think about the context in which we're doing this, the geographical context, the portfolio of energy consumption and availability in our region, and that affects any decision. So I used to live in Colorado. The sun shines 310 days a year in Colorado. It's also fairly cool, and solar panels, the efficiency decreases when they heat up, generally speaking. So that's a very good place to put a bunch of photovoltaics on the grid. It's cost effective. People are going to do that and they'll get a return on their investment. And it just makes a lot of sense. So we can do that and achieve a bunch of different objectives at the same time. We can stay afloat financially. We can create renewable energy. Everybody wins. California, similar situation. There's other portions of the country, West Texas, for example, where the wind resource is really great. So it makes a whole lot of sense just from a business perspective to generate a bunch of energy with wind. I encourage everybody to take a look at the National Renewable Energy Lab. They put out some really good resources. If you're interested in data visualization or anything around renewable energy, they put out these really good maps that show the resource for solar and wind and a bunch of different metrics throughout the country. If you look at that, you see that unfortunately, the upper Midwest and including Ohio, other than maybe the northwest corner of Ohio, we have a relatively poor solar resource and we have a relatively poor wind resource as well. And our solar resource is particularly bad in the winter when all of our energy needs are really coming to the fore because of this heating demand. So all that was a lead up to if our ultimate engineering goal is to provide for what our community needs without adding carbon to the atmosphere. So that's our engineering goal. There's two ways we could go about that. One is by creating more energy through renewable generation. So, and again, that's a good solution if you're in California or West Texas, et cetera. Maybe not as much for Ohio. The other way we can do it is to bring the demand down through energy efficiency, right? That by far, I think, is the best thing we can do here in Ohio to reduce the amount of anthropogenic emissions. And this is what the CHP is getting at. We're vastly increasing the efficiency, which means we don't have to generate as much to start with. That has the exact same effect as actually another good resource. If you look at the Rocky Mountain Institute, Google that, and Amory Lovins, who was one of the pioneers in this field, he was doing this energy efficiency stuff before it was cool. And he's got this great diagram where it shows if we save 1 joule or 1 kilowatt of energy at the site, then we're saving something like 3 at the generation, and several units of energy if we go back all the way to pulling it out of the ground. So energy efficiency is really the best thing we can do here for multiple reasons, and that has the same effect as the renewable generation that most people in the comments are talking about, and possibly even more of an effect because we have that multiplicative effect downstream. So it's something to think about, and remember that we have to think about things in terms of also what the status quo is and what the alternatives are, right? We can always compare things to the perfect, and we're always going to lose, right? But the status quo is we're generating heat and electricity in Ohio by setting fossil fuels on fire. That's going to continue to be the case if we do nothing, right? One thing that we can do to improve the emissions profile of Ohio State University is by reducing the amount of energy consumption that we need. That's probably the most effective thing that we can do right now.
Okay, thanks. Scott, did you want to?
No, I think Jordan and Mike summed it up well. I've been busy typing answers. Anthony just asked, what I mentioned that CHP is not the ultimate solution. So let me just answer it live. What is the ultimate solution? Well, hopefully I survive long enough to see that ultimate solution, but who knows? I have, I have faith, and actually I have hope that that ultimate solution might come from Ohio State. Carbon capture and sequestration has been something that Ohio State has been digging into from a research perspective for more than a decade. And most carbon capture is still not cost effective because of the amount of energy it takes. But there are some things on the horizon, some new technologies that we're beginning to see, and adding something like that to a fossil combustion facility could all of a sudden turn a power plant into a zero emission power plant. Or maybe solar thermal becomes a viable market alternative. Or maybe the creation of electric fired steam generators on a scale that's necessary for industrial use would become a possibility. But the ultimate solution doesn't exist today. And that's why I'm a real believer in the practical solution, which is take the best step you can today, and then tomorrow look again and take the next best step.
Yeah, so let's talk a bit about that, because the step we're taking is to invest a tremendous amount of money in building this facility. And once built, we're going to use it. I mean, it's not that we're not going to use it. So let's talk about what that implies for the profile of resource use over time from Ohio State. And are we locked into using natural gas then forever and ever, given that we're building this facility?
I take a pessimistic point of view to begin with. So we modeled the plant on the assumption that renewable natural gas and or clean green hydrogen would not become a reality during the life of the plant. We built the plant to accept those gases, but we modeled it on the assumption that that didn't happen. So our environmental analysis and our economic analysis assumes worst case. So you're right. We're gonna build this plant. It's an expensive endeavor. It's $280 million expensive, and it's going to, from the moment we turn it on, it's still not going to be enough to supply all of Ohio State. I think it's important to point out, like Mike was talking about, that we are a growing university with ever increasing demands, and we need to meet those demands in the best way possible. This power plant will not produce all the electricity that Ohio State consumes. It will not enable us to immediately shut down or eliminate all of McCracken, but it does give us, I hope, a bridge to a better solution that may be coming down the road. You know, the financial modeling says that in the first 6 to 8 years, this plant will produce a positive cash flow for Ohio State, meaning we'll be paying less on the plant. We'll be saving more in energy than we're paying for the plant. Our analysis shows that somewhere around year 11 or 12, we'll actually be, we'll have paid the entire plant back with savings. So even though it's a 25-year payback on a projected 30-year plant, we've been very conservative in the analysis. So the way we're looking at it is, if some new solution comes down the pike in 10 or 15 years, I think the university will be in a position to say we don't want the plant anymore. And it will be okay because it will have already paid for itself, and it will have been that bridge to the next best solution.
So Mike, talk about this a little bit. I mean, in terms of what that next best solution could be. I mean, there are alternative fuels that could fuel this plant. Am I right about that?
That's right. Scott just referenced that whether it's renewable natural gas, how that's referred to as, most folks know that as biogas. There are lower emissions anticipated from biogas sources, but there are other environmental impacts of generating biogas. So that's, normally in the agricultural field to generate biogases that can then be replacing traditional natural gas that is, drilled out of the earth. But those, have some environmental offsets as well. Those are available now. They are somewhat cost prohibitive, and they are, just takes a different approach, I guess, to obtain those than we would through the traditional natural gas market. I think there's a lot of discussion around, and it's in the climate action plan, obviously, of utilizing green hydrogen. And there's been a fair amount of appropriate pushback on that, given how long that topic has been discussed and researched by many different universities and entities globally. But there aren't a lot of options for replacing heating energy sources kind of on a one-to-one basis. Hydrogen represents an opportunity for that. And as a research university, we should be investing in ways to off-ramp fossil fuels for new alternative energies. And I think, Elena, you might be able to speak to this, but I think we did just fund some research in this regard through the Seed Grant program to look at a portion of this. But hopefully this will be a part of a much larger research strategy for the university moving forward with its energy partners to develop not just green hydrogen, but potentially other items, as Scott referenced, solar thermal, other ways to generate heat in a renewable manner, truly renewable manner. So I think are of course going to remain open to those, and as they're available, seek to incorporate and fold those into our energy mix. But they are just not viable right now.
I want to go to a question that was in the Q&A about the city of Columbus making a pledge to go 100% renewable, and why is it the city's doing that and OSU is not doing that? I mean, Mike, could you speak to that question?
Yeah, again, the city's plan is to provide electricity through renewable energy. The issue that, and I'm sure this sounds repetitive, the issue that is driving the decision around the CHP is not electricity. It's how do we generate heat, and there are not renewable sources for generating heat at the scale that we need. So it's great that the city is doing that. As a resident of Columbus, I'm excited about that plan and ready to pull the lever for it. But that is only going to address electricity. It's not going to address residential natural gas use for heating purposes or other fuels that residents use for heating.
Gotcha. There's a question here. According to the FAQ document, the statistics provided for emission reductions with the project do not include methane emissions at the point of extraction. Massive emissions come from fracking wells themselves, as in an explosion in Belmont County, 2018. And so the question basically is about this question of fugitive methane leakage. You know, again, kind of coming back to the environmental impacts that were considered in the decision, to what extent were any of those types of impacts considered? And again, it comes back to this trade-off of how do we weigh the potential impacts of the fugitive methane leakages with the impacts from the greenhouse gas emissions from the current choices that OSU has made. Scott, in terms of the environmental impact assessment that was done, can you speak to that a little bit?
Sure. Though not required under state law because we're a public institution, and in response to the concerns, we did engage at considerable cost a third party, an outside independent analysis, air quality analysis, and it came back and showed the full analysis is available publicly, but it showed negligible and minimal impacts. For me to go beyond that would be far beyond my limited understanding of air science, but it's available. It's available on the commission's, the Ohio Power Siting Board's case website, but we can also make it available through SI if we need to.
So there was an earlier question about documents and what documents are available, you know, that went into this decision. Could you clarify that?
Yeah, so again, back to the Power Siting Board. So the CHP was first brought to the university over 2 years ago and discussed publicly. It's been at public sessions of the Board of Trustees 4 times. It's been presented to the University Senate, Senate Fiscal, the President's Council on Sustainability, the USG, and a number of other entities over the course of several, or two plus years. What's available, you know, the documentation includes a detailed feasibility analysis, in-depth environmental impact, noise impact, construction impact, ecological, cultural, water, cost analysis. If the Ohio Power Siting Board really has quite an extensive review process. So they look at everything imaginable from the view shed. So we had to do a 10-mile and then a 5-mile and then a 1-mile analysis of the view shed. In other words, what's the visual impact of the facility on people's view of the area. We had to do a cultural analysis to make sure they're, the soil that will be disturbed is of not has no cultural significance. There's documentation that we notified over 400 local, what we are called adjacent property owners and tenants. I'll note that of the 400, we had comments from 2 of them, and both of the comments from both of them, one literally asked, do we need to be, we don't care about this plant, do we need to participate? And the other one was really, hey, can I come and tour? So from, from the tenant, the adjacent property owners, which include hospitals, businesses, apartments, and tenants, we didn't really get any negative feedback from them. There's several hundred pages of testimony, a few hundred pages of cross-examination of witnesses. There is an extensive commission finding an order, which sort of goes through each argument and then sort of lays out why the Power Siting Board agreed with or disagreed with each point of view. And so that's all available on the website. But like I said, we can make it more available, through SI or some way if we want to. It's voluminous.
Related to that, there's a question in chat about, in addition to the institution and financial aspects, it's also important to consider the civil society in decision making. How can you justify the construction of the power plant when the majority of public comments are in opposition to the construction? And the last question of part of that is, who were the decision makers in this process? So I'm wondering, could you just review for us, Scott, what was the decision-making process with the university?
Yeah, so at the university level, before we applied to the Power Siting Board, it was sort of the process I just described. And the university's been looking at this for more than a decade. But when the decision was made to go forward, we publicly made an announcement that we were going to ask OSEP to do a feasibility study. They produced that feasibility study. It was reviewed by a number of entities on campus, and most importantly, the Energy Advisory Committee, which is a committee of administrators, faculty members, subject matter faculty members, as well, and students. They reviewed that. That then went to the Board of Trustees. The Board of Trustees authorized a preliminary approval to look for a site on campus. So that process took about another year, and the current site was selected against 5 sites were examined. This site was selected. Then it went back to the Board of Trustees, where they approved another limited approval to go for a preliminary design such that it would be sufficient to file an application with the Power Siting Board. Then we went to the Power Siting Board. I think our application to them included over 2,600 pages of documentation. The Power Siting Board is comprised of the chairman of the Public Utilities Commission, representation from Ohio EPA, Ohio Department of Natural Resources, Ohio Department of Development, and public citizens. They go through this detailed process, which is all limited and defined by state statute. We have public hearings, then we have an adjudicated or evidentiary hearing where parties that are granted entry, and in this case was Sierra Club, are granted entry, testimonies filed, parties cross-examine each other, and then it goes ultimately back to the Power Siting Board for consideration. And their consideration is not really subject to whim. they have to decide within the confines of the statutory obligations. The statute really defines what can be approved and what cannot be.
Scott, I think there's a question about just how faculty and students were engaged in the process. Could you speak a little bit to that?
Yeah, prior to the application and just while we're still considering it, faculty and students through the Energy Advisory Committee, through the Presidents and Provost Council, through the COPE, which has both faculty and students on it. COPE is the Committee on the Physical Environment, which is a permanent subcommittee of the University Senate. It was presented to the University Senate, which includes, obviously both faculty and students, Senate Fiscal, and to the College Finance Committee. It's also, and this is sort of anecdotally, has been presented in many classes when professors have became aware of it and asked if we would do, presentations or sort of CHP 101s in classes. And I know I myself have done a number of those, and my colleague has done a number, and I believe the company has been in a number of classrooms. So that was the process all prior to going public to the Board of Trustees for those public discussions.
Gotcha. At this point, I think I'm going to ask Matt or others who've been monitoring Q&A, because I know there's a lot there, and I want to make sure that we are aggregating appropriately in terms of what the questions are. Matt, have you been monitoring Q&A, and can you help us with throwing out a few of the questions that seem to be rising to the top?
Yeah, for sure, Lena. You've done a good job of monitoring most of the questions. I think there's a lot of similar questions asking now about Ohio State's place as a land grant university and whether that makes us a call to be the one to innovate where others may not be. And so I'm not sure if, Alina, you can frame that for our panelists.
Well, I absolutely think that there is, we have an extra responsibility as a land grant institution to the outreach and engagement to our communities. And I know that there's a tremendous amount of concern about what some of those impacts are on communities who are in the rural regions, particularly in terms of the shale gas development and those environmental impacts on the land and the water. And I fully share those concerns. The Sustainability Institute is very much about trying to do the work and support the work of how we make this transition away from a fossil fuel economy to a renewable zero carbon emissions society. But this is not something that happens overnight. It's not something that happens all at once. It is an incremental process. And it is one, like any sustainability issue, is not black and white. It would be wonderful if we didn't have to consider other trade-offs, financial trade-offs, and other concerns, but we do. We are a public university, and we have a very strong mandate to our land grant mission, which includes a mandate to being responsible in terms of how we're managing our resources, including our financial resources. So it's just not going to be the case that we will be able to make a decision that is absent considerations of economics and of finances. Within that constraint, it's always going to be a constrained decision-making context in which we're making these decisions. Within that, we are completely dedicated to advancing a sustainable economy, but we can't do it all at once, and we have to do it within the constraints that we're given. So, Ohio State is absolutely committed to helping with understanding what these impacts are. We have faculty and students who are engaged in that research We have extension agents that have been engaged with these communities for decades now, helping these communities sort out and deal with the kinds of impacts that are changing their communities that have come along with this energy transition, including shale gas, including other kinds of impacts that have come from Ohio State's energy mix. And as Mike pointed out earlier, you always have to remember what the comparison is. The comparison is to coal. Coal is, Ohio is still very much dependent on coal as part of a large portion of its energy mix. And the impact of burning coal and the impact of that coal extraction is equally important in terms of considering. And so as OSU has considered this decision, those are the trade-offs. Those are the trade-offs that are considered. So there is no perfect solution. And the mission of the land grant is to try to help the university, try to help our students, try to help our faculty and our communities make these decisions in the best way possible, and to do the research, to do the outreach, to do the engagement with the communities to do that. And we are always striving to do better, and there's always going to be room for doing better. And we want to do that in a way that is also engaging across a number of different communities and students and populations. So I don't know that I answered the question, Matt, but in terms of does Ohio State take its land grant mission seriously? Absolutely. Is Ohio State working with these communities? Yes, Ohio State is. And we're constantly trying to figure out, a major goal of the university from a land grant mission is to do the research on the innovations that we can then help to scale and commercialize and implement in our communities to make those innovations come to life. And so as part of that, there's a lot of work going on here at the Ohio State University. Jordan gave a little bit of a window into what some of that work is, but there's a lot more that is going on. There's a lot more that's coming, including major innovations in the energy space.
Thank you, Elena. There have also been some questions about concerns about negative air impacts, both in the Columbus campus, on the Columbus campus, and in the communities where extraction may occur. And I was wondering, I know we've spoken on it a little bit already, but I was wondering if you or one of our panelists could address those concerns about air quality impacts from the CHP plant.
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy for others to answer that as well, but I think the point goes back to what is the comparison, and air quality impacts of coal are worse than air quality impacts of burning coal, I should say, than of air quality impacts of burning natural gas. That's not to say that there are, of course, negative impacts of burning a fossil fuel. That is absolutely the case, and that's the end goal is to get to a point where we're not burning any fossil fuels and where we do have a fully renewable economy. But we're not there at this point, and the progress is incremental. So in terms of the air quality impacts, Scott talked about the environmental impact assessment that was done. It showed negligible impacts at a county level, within Franklin County. I don't know if they did anything that was more localized than that. That's an open question that we could find out. And what those impacts look like close versus far away, I think that's a legitimate question, and I don't know the answer to that. So perhaps, Scott, that's something that we could come back to the company that did do the environmental impact assessment to ask whether they did that, unless you know the answer to that question.
Yeah, we can provide the document in detail, but if I recall correctly, I know it was local. including monitors at the Wexner Medical Center,
Yep.
monitors on the far east side of campus near 71, as well as very close to the plant, sort of juxtaposition right to the plant. I don't have the full list. I don't have the document in front of me, but yeah, it did include local, not just Franklin County.
Thank you. There have also been a lot of questions about where students might be, what information and data students might be able to access as it pertains to decision-making for the CHP plant. And I know we've talked about that a little bit already, but if we could just restate where students will be able to go for information and what information might be accessible to them.
Scott, would you like to answer that?
All the documentation that I mentioned is available. The easiest place to get it is directly from the Ohio Power Siting Board docketing place, because all of it's sort of listed in chronological order. The analysis done and the feasibility study, that's there. I don't think there's anything that's not there, if I'm trying to think through it, except maybe the transcripts of the discussions at the Board of Trustees, and those are naturally available on the Board of Trustees site, but we could download that and disseminate it. I will note that the Board of Trustees transcripts are, start when the meeting opens and run nonstop. So it's not easily searchable. You sort of have to read through lots of stuff you won't care about to get to that discussion, but it's there.
Matt, I don't know if you've put the link in chat or I guess it was shared out in the invitation with the link to the documents on the sustainability, the website.
We did not link to that in the invite, but we can follow up to this email to all attendees with some information on where they can go for that information.
Great. Sounds good. So as we're wrapping up, just want to ask and give Jordan or Mike or Scott a last opportunity to share any final thoughts that you might have.
No, I just appreciate all of the questions. It doesn't bother me that, I'm not afraid of negative questions or opposition questions. It's the best way to get to a good answer. I think the dialogue, I think there's been a lot of dialogue for 2 years and it's ramped up right now, but I'm hopeful that we will all see this as, it's not a perfect step, but it's a good step. And it's certainly a good step on what we hope is a bridge to the next best step.
Okay. Well, with that, I want to thank everybody. Thank you, Scott, very much for being with us tonight. Mike, thank you. Jordan, thank you. And thanks to Matt Griffin as well for organizing the panel and keeping us going in terms of Q&A. And I mostly just really want to thank the students for joining. I know this is an issue that so many of you are very passionate about. And I greatly appreciate that you're thinking hard about this, that you're pushing us, that you're asking difficult questions. As Scott said, this is really, how we make progress on these things. And I think no one here is saying that this is a perfect solution. I think everybody feels like if we could, we would go to a zero carbon emissions economy tomorrow, and we would embrace doing that. I hope that the discussion here today has helped to shed a little bit more light on what some of the constraints are in the decision and why the university has made the decision that it did, and the ways in which it is advancing the climate action plan in terms of reducing emission reductions towards our 2030 goal and towards zero emission goal in 2050. There's a lot more work here that needs to be done. And we greatly appreciate and value the passion that our students bring. And I know that we will not, come to a full agreement, and that really wasn't the goal tonight at all. The goal tonight was really to help share information so that people had the opportunity to learn a little bit more about and get some of your questions answered. If there are more questions, we are definitely committed to trying to answer them. And so we will look through the questions that were in the Q&A. We'll look through the questions that were in the chat, and anything that was not in the FAQ, that was not adequately addressed here in the panel tonight. We will make our best attempt to provide answers to you guys, because we absolutely are committed to trying to facilitate as much information as we can and help everyone understand the considerations of the decision. So with that, let me also just remind you that a recording of the webinar will be made available after the event. As Matt said, we will be sure to share the web link with you. And if you do find that you have additional questions after this, please do feel free to send those additional questions to sustainability@osu.edu. And again, we will do our best to get your questions answered. Thank you all very much, and have a good rest of your evening.